Russian drones attacked and damaged the harbor and grain storage facilities in the south of Ukraine's coast in Odessa region, setting some of the buildings and facilities on fire. Russia stepped up attacks on Ukrainian agricultural and port infrastructure after the Kremlin refused to extend the Black Sea grain deal that had allowed for exports of Ukrainian grain. The enemy is trying to destroy Ukrainian grain, attacking industrial and port infrastructure. Unfortunately, there were missiles incoming. The silo was damaged and the fires broke out at the site. Serhiy Brachuk, spokesperson of the Ukrainian Army South, said. Mr. Brachuk also added, Russia is trying to cut Ukraine out of the future grain agreement and, most importantly, to strategically displace our country from the global food market. However, Ukraine's Danube river ports became a vital lifeline for Ukraine's grain exports after Russia left the Black Sea grain deal in mid-July. So my question to you, Mr. Glauber, as an expert, the point of these attacks. I mean, does Russia really want to destroy the Ukrainian harbors and ports and all the infrastructure? And in your opinion, as an expert, can Russia succeed with all that, doing this?
Yeah, no, this is a very unwelcome development, obviously. The pulling out of the Black Sea grain agreement was very unfortunate. I think, there's no question that's been vital for Ukraine to be able to export grain. But Ukraine has been investing in particularly the ports on the Danube as an alternative way, albeit a little more costly, but still less costly than shipping overland through Poland or Slovakia. So this escalation certainly seems like it's an attempt by Russia to prevent Ukraine from exporting grain in any sort of fashion.
Thank you very much for your answer. The deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey a year ago had allowed Ukraine to keep exports flowing through its deep water ports on the Black Sea in order to ease a global food crisis.
The Black Sea Grain Initiative, negotiated by the United Nations and Turkey, delivered over 32 million tons of Ukrainian foodstuffs to the world.
Non cessiamo di pregare per la martoriata Ucraina, dove la guerra distrugge tutto, anche il grano.
The normal access of Ukrainian grain to international markets.
Russia quit the deal on July 17th, complaining that sanctions on its own grain and fertilizers exports had not been eased and warning that ships heading to Ukrainian seaports could be considered military targets from now on. As a result of the deal's collapse, Ukrainian grain exports in July were down 40% from June, analysts said. On the other hand, the threat forced Ukraine, instead of shipping through sea coastal ports, to funnel more grain shipments through the Danube river ports, which had handled at least a quarter of all exports before the Black Sea Agreement ended. The Black Sea Grain Agreement. Was it really that important? And for who? For Ukraine? For the rest of the world?
Well, unfortunately, the war is exacted a terrible toll on Ukraine agriculture, right? I mean, its production now is down 35-40%. If you think back last year, at the time the grain agreement went into effect, the agreement was so important because, Ukraine had so many inventories at the time because they were unable to market 2021 crops. They were the wheat crop that was just coming off that had been planted in fall of 2021 prior to the war. Good harvest, trying to get that into storage and try to get it to market. And there was real concern that by October and November that there would just be no storage available and that a lot of crops would have to be stored on the ground and subject to spoil and other things. I think the agreement was vital in terms of all of a sudden boosting exports to the 4 to 5 million ton area that helps helped get a lot of those supplies to market. But as we look forward, the production is down, and that means exports are down as well. But there still has to be a way to get those supplies to market. There's I think with the Black Sea closed and with disruptions on the Ukraine or the Danube ports, I think the real concern is that we would come up against storage problems again. That all this means, of course, low prices for Ukraine farmers, and I think that's the real damage in one sense is that farmers who are already paying very high input costs and not being able to see good prices to help profitability there.
So Ukraine is the country to suffer the most from what Russia did, killing the deal.
Well, I think directly there's no question. The world loses, obviously, as well. One is because it loses Ukraine as a very major grain exporter. We've already, I would argue that they've already lost part of it this year by the fact that production is down. And I think if this continues, obviously, next year doesn't look more favorable, certainly. And to the degree that Ukraine, was one of the top 5 grain exporters in the world, to have them their position now substantially less, that means the world has to find grain. And there is a lot of grain in the world right now, but all it would take is a drought or a major disruption somewhere else in the world,
Absolutely.
and we would see very high prices.
In terms of Russia, what is it? A blackmail? An attempt of blackmailing the world with the probable, possible famine, with Hunger Games. Is that the reason?
Yeah, frankly, it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to move away much more than the obvious one, that it's a war, and they are doing, this is a very awful act, I think, because it hits so many people. These shouldn't be viewed as military targets, I think, and yet they have been, and almost from the beginning. So I think that's the real sad aspect of this, and the dreadful aspect of it, frankly. Not just obviously for the Ukraine people, but also for globally, for the world's hungry and those who import these grains.
Thank you. The Kremlin has repeatedly stated that the grain under the Black Sea Agreement goes to Europe and not to those countries in need. Well, please educate me. How the grain from the world markets gets to countries? What are these main logistical arteries? What are the ways?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I think it's a bit misunderstood by many. First of all, Ukraine is a very large producer of maize. Maize typically is sold not so much to developing countries, because the maize that is produced and sold by Ukraine is for animals, for the most part. And these are animal feed, and that goes to countries like Europe or China that import big quantities of this. So I think maize is a separate category, although we have seen a lot of maize go to the Mideast and North Africa from Ukraine through the Black Sea Grain Agreement. But turning to wheat, I think wheat is one that, yes, Ukraine prior to the war, shipped grain everywhere. And had been an increasing presence in many markets, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Through the Black Sea Grain Agreement and largely through World Food Program, we saw 4 or 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Sudan, as recipients of wheat. But, particularly because in the early months of the war, Ukraine went before the Black Sea Grain Agreement, it was very difficult to get wheat out to this normal market. So some did end up in Europe. But I think we look at countries like Bangladesh or Indonesia or some of the other countries that were importing in South Asia weren't able to import as much. But again, I think Ukraine has done an incredible job just getting grain to the market, given these harsh circumstances. So. And lastly, I would say that having the grain on the world market is good for everyone, because that lowers prices, and that's good for consumers. So even if it's not going individually to a specific country, it is being bought by someone at lower prices that everyone benefits.
Yeah, well, that someone probably just has no choice. You have to buy this grain, and Ukraine has to sell it. So maybe, I'm in no way saying that the war is a good thing, but maybe it's kind of an impetus to some other ways for the grain delivery for the world, for the Western world, and for Ukraine. Do you think that is the case?
Well, I would say this. I think the markets have been remarkably resilient in the world. So if you look at countries like Egypt that have imported a lot of grain from the Mideast, or from the Black Sea rather, they have found other suppliers because, again, there's a lot of other countries in the world that grow wheat and export wheat. I think these buyers, by the way, will turn right back to the Black Sea, I think, once the war is over and once Ukraine is able to export wheat again in the quantities they were doing pre-war levels. I think, Ukraine is very attractively located, particularly for those countries in the Eastern Mediterranean. But as we've seen from all over, because Ukraine really has, if you look at the scope of their exports, they go to countries all over the world.